I don't think I need to review the rules of engagement. Today's our third Network A virtual session on proliferation and governance in meso-level settings. We have yet again a strong group of presenters and interesting papers on topics. I urge those of you who are just coming in now to take a look at some of the papers in the prior two sessions. There are papers on housing and others on cooperatives that you might, Andrew and Nicholas might find helpful. For our next presentation, we have Carla Young. Carla, you about ready to go? Stronger Together, Balancing Heterogeneity and Enabling Inclusion at Meso-level in Secondary Cooperatives and Cooperative Support Organizations. Carla comes to us from the Institute for Ecological Economy Research in Berlin. Thank you, Carla. The floor is yours and welcome. Okay, Stronger Together. I stole that motto from the National Co-op Grocers, which is a meso-level organization, a secondary cooperative in the US, which might be interesting to Nicholas Pohl. Yeah, this is firmly a meso-level research question. How do we balance heterogeneity and enable inclusion in cooperative support organizations? So we're looking at secondary cooperative structures, which I depicted a diagram here. So why should we look at the meso-level? I mean, it's in the name of the session, but still what motivates this research is the need to buffer alternative economic organizations from environmental pressures. They tend to be stronger together. And in this diagram, you see the typical structure of a secondary cooperative. In this case, it's the Bürgerwerke Community Energy cooperative in Germany. That's a case of this exact model. So a group of primary cooperatives gets together to found a secondary cooperative that they own and govern, and they outsource certain functions to this organization in order to leverage scale or build specialized capabilities. And maybe if you're based in the US, you might recognize this from Organic Valley, even though the members of Organic Valley might not be co-ops themselves, but the whole proposition of building scale together is the same. So cooperative support organizations provide various benefits and services to their members, and the most salient of which are economic scale and professionalization, as well as communications and knowledge infrastructure. But there's also a risk associated with building that secondary level power. Those secondary cooperatives may also grow into drivers of management ideology, marketization, and efficiency goals, subordinating democratic practicing member organizations to economic success of the collective. And this risk is actually so pronounced that politically more radical fields, such as the community-supported agriculture in Germany, which Philip is going to present on, shy away from building formal secondary organizations. And instead, they support each other through a network type of support infrastructure. So what I'm interested in is articulating the conditions, enabling heterogeneity and inclusion, not only in primary collectivist democratic organizations, but also at this meso-level. Because I think that that will be crucial in gaining stability in fields of alternative economies. And maybe you remember Jason Spicer talking about the soul of community land trusts on Tuesday. Here it's quite similarly about the spirit of cooperation and how that kind of can be continued even as scaling takes place. So the larger research project, Teilgabe, that Philip and I are part of, studies cases of cooperative and collectivist primary and secondary organizations in several operational sectors to look at the relationships between primary and secondary organizations and what functions secondary organizations fulfill, and the support they provide and the scaling they afford. And we've collected qualitative and survey data in the fields of community-supported agriculture, senior self-help co-ops, community renewable energy co-ops, digital platform co-ops, and there's also someone's side project on pubs. And in case you're interested in these specific fields or sectors, I'm just showing you the teams who do the respective field work in case you want to be in touch. The scope of this project is Germany only, which is typical for research funded by ministries. So what I'm presenting today is a developing inductive theme in this broader project. And the challenge of balancing inequality or diversity among organizational membership became salient for us during data collection. So what you're seeing here is a picture I took at the Community Energy Co-op's secondary cooperative annual general meeting. They have a very strong established secondary cooperative, and I traveled to beautiful Heidelberg in the sunny and wealthy south of Germany to observe this general meeting. And I also organized a data gathering workshop on the question, how could your secondary cooperative develop going forward? What are the membership's needs? And there were a lot of productive suggestions, but also at some point, this board member in the purple polo shirt started making some remarks to me that he wonders what with all the professionalization, whether smaller, less professional co-ops are at risk of falling behind when they don't actually benefit from services as much or don't share the growth goals of the secondary organization. And I recognize this tension from my own dissertation work in the US, where the national co-op grocers were not working with tiny and unprofessional food co-ops in order to stabilize their own economic position. So there was a process of exclusion taking place. And just a side note, you may have noticed that the level of individual diversity in this picture is also fantastically low. And that's fairly representative of the community energy field. And so we've also certainly taken note of that. But given the framing of this session for now, I'm going to continue talking about the meso-level, so organizational diversity. So a conceptual question that's been keeping me on my toes is, can scaling and diversity go together? So the assumption is that cooperative scaling is to some degree necessary or desirable in order to stabilize these alternative economic organizations. And it's often enabled by similarities among member organizations. For example, through a shared demand for certain supplies, shared growth goals, shared operational systems. So then diversity or inequality among organizations in a field presents a challenge to economic scaling. So smaller organizations may want to participate in some support services, but not in others. They may also be set locally in very diverging socioeconomic locations whose idiosyncrasies require a lot of local knowledge, once again inhibiting the role of a secondary organization. In democratic governance, the primary level can also limit the adaptation of primary organizations for the goals at meso-level. Why is that even a problem? So there's two sort of undesirable outcomes if we don't sort of develop this topic further, in my view. So the first undesirable outcome is that secondary cooperatives sometimes limit membership by cherry picking and promoting a certain model of scaling, which I've observed in the food co-op scene in the US. Similarly, they may lobby for specific local practices or even recommend certain governance systems that make the primary members more efficient and exclude diverging actors from participation. So that establishes a dynamic of interference with local democratic governance. So I call that the cooperative devolution path. But of course, the converse and also undesirable outcome is that there's no scaling whatsoever. No attempts are being made at intensifying cooperation or pooling resources, and local autonomy is maintained, but there's also no benefits derived from cooperating. So the question is, how can secondary structures be built and run such that they operate at that sort of sweet spot between under-organizing and over-organizing? So this is where it gets a little sort of experimental. We've only started thinking about this, where to take this topic, and what you learn in the grad school is to take best-selling titles and tweak them, because that gets you an immediate understanding of what kind of question you're getting at. So here's my attempt at using Joyce Rothschild's work, which is known in this setting. So what are the conditions facilitating a fill-in-the-blank organization at meso-level? Basically wondering what we're looking for exactly, which I'm going to circle back to in a moment. But first, let's see what these conditions might be. So homogeneity among member organizations can be advantageous on a number of counts when it comes to cooperating among cooperatives. That's Rothschild has identified that as a condition for, easy, efficient collaboration, and economically homogeneity can help with economies of scale. But there's also utility to heterogeneity for returns to scale, so complementary capabilities and regional scope that can also add to the powers of the network. And third, there's also a tension between sort of efficient management and professionalization at the secondary organization versus the value of maintaining slower democratic process. So if you have to do a lot of deliberation work because you have heterogeneous membership, that also slows you down. Then the term subsidiarity, that might be a very German political concept, but that's one way in which cooperative values and principles guard against a top-down degeneration process by maintaining subsidiarity, the fact of making decisions at the most local organizational level possible within federated structures. That can be organized and also culturally maintained. And horizontal
Carla,
solidarity.
You're at 5 minutes.
Okay.
5 minutes.
Horizontal solidarity means that there's a spirit of cooperation and not competition as the norm between members. And second, democratic practice, governance and participation is a principle of cooperatives. Its active implementation in practice and over time is a formidable task. And how secondary organizations, which are democratically governed themselves, practice democracy in heterogeneous membership settings might be another central condition for balancing diversity. And then, of course, reflexivity, according to Catherine Chen, is one enabling feature for collectivist organizations, and that might work the same way at meso-level. So the sweet spot between under and over-organizing identified by Chen provides orientation for a similar process at the level of secondary organizations. And then I just put inclusivity with a question mark. What does inclusivity possibly mean with regard to cooperative support organizations? Beyond the mutual support relationships, are steps taken to make meso-level structures more inclusive? And what would that even mean? I'm not super aware of work and literature in this on this concept, so that would be interesting to look into further and get some feedback. So let's look at some very initial observations from case studies on these conditions and processes. So in the field of community energy co-ops, subsidiarity is highly maintained, and primary co-ops prefer to start new projects on their own terms. And they continue doing their own collaborations based on regional ties rather than brokered by the secondary co-ops. By the same token, solidarity is also limited to the pooling of resources and friendly relationships. There's no formal redistribution of resources at the meso-level. And here on the right side, that's the community-supported agriculture. And in that field, we find there's widespread resistance to scaling and to attempts at professionalization. The cooperative support structure in the field is actually a network rather than a secondary organization. So there's currently no risk of top-down dynamics, and solidarity is organized equally informally in so-called roundtable harvest distribution events. But the exclusion of economically disadvantaged groups occurs prior to these situations.
2 minutes.
So when we look at democratic governance, an interesting solution that the Bürgerwerke have found for the inequality or diversity among their members is that they don't allot votes by volume of members' business, which is very common in secondary co-ops. They actually have reflected on this approach, and they conduct a bespoke calculation of votes per member for each AGM in order to limit the power of larger members to less than 5% of total votes. And in interviews, it became clear to me that primary members had very high degrees of trust and actually didn't show up to the AGM most of the time. They didn't have the time. That actually signals that there's not a lot of hot conflict in the secondary co-op. Meanwhile, in the community-supported agriculture field, there's a lot of deliberation on possible developments at meso-level, and there's a lot of informal exchange and participation in voluntary thematic working groups. So heterogeneity plays out in the community and energy field in that there's a lot of classic economies of scale going on. Members all use the energy distribution service, but not all members have access to resources for growing by way of building new solar or wind projects. There's a huge east-west, north-south wealth gap. Some of the members feel like they're islands in their region, and then the secondary co-op can't help with that. Some members are so small they're entirely volunteer run, and they can't even find the time to set up the website that actually hosts the template that is delivered by the secondary cooperative, so they need help receiving the help. What's positive is that the Bürgerwerke still maintains sort of a code where investment in the secondary cooperative is voluntary at this point, but that doesn't mean it can't change. Okay,
Carla, you're at time. So
I'm at time. Okay, so I'm going to jump to my last slide. So the question with inclusivity is, well, is that a civic or cooperative value? Now I'm making a little, taking a little side look at the individual level. All case studies constitute white German middle class phenomena, and we haven't really observed attempts at active recruitment of other groups. There's a sort of a club mentality in many of the niches, but there are actions towards certain groups. So in the community supported agriculture, there's a against right-wing tendencies group that helps members in excluding misaligned individuals, and there's also some gender equality action in the platform co-op field. So the question is, might we not expect a little more from sort of national level meso organizations in terms of supporting members' transformative power? And that brings me to sort of the last open question. So yeah, this is sort of a conceptually open attempt to deal with some inductive data. So what should we call that cooperative support organization that we're looking for? Would it be an inclusive cooperative support organization, enabling, accessible, devolution proof? These are all interests that I have, conditions of, reflexive cooperative support organizations. And maybe these are some questions that people would want to engage with. Okay, I'm going to try to.
Thank you.
Unshare.
Thank you, Carla. If you could unshare the screen. Our final presenter, Andrew Messamore from UT Austin, mapping housing movements in the United States, trends from big networks among urban civil society leaders. Andrew, the floor is yours.
All right, howdy everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Marc. Thank you, Pat, for all of your work organizing the panel. I will try to be as quick as possible so we get some time for questions. I am going to be presenting on a slightly different topic than the other folks here. I'm going to be covering housing movement coalitions in the United States, not cooperatives. But I think some of the themes of the talk around formalization and integration of governance on different scales are going to cross over well here. So just to give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about, if I can't get through everything quickly, Housing movements representing low-income renters are increasingly important in US cities where they're shaping policy and equality, but we don't know a lot about the organizational structures and dynamics of the coalitions that are emerging around housing movements, particularly these formal organizations in them. So I've developed a data and methodology for understanding the organizational coalitions in urban civil society around housing activism, one which uses very large networks to understand relationships among civil society leaders. I've done this in the 148 largest US cities and tracked these networks over the last 20 years. My results are that formal organizational coalitions around housing activism are actually quite widespread in US cities. It's not just a feature of very large cosmopolitan metropolises. And I find that concentrated disadvantage, municipal expenditures on public services, and protective tenant regulations are predictive of the emergence of these coalitions. So just to give you a brief overview of what's going on, we are entering a new policy environment in the US where we're seeing a number of different kinds of protective regulations emerging around renting. Just to give you some examples from 2019, we saw the emergence of the Tenant Protection Act in California, which was a law that created new rent caps on renting, as well as just cause eviction protections, which meant you actually had to give a reason for evicting people, which is previously not really the case. You could do it for any justification. And at the same time, we saw all sorts of different kinds of initiatives around affordable housing, density, and in some places, laws like COPA in San Francisco, which allows tenants the right of first offer on purchasing their apartment building from their landlord if they're threatened with displacement. So this was a wave of different kinds of laws that are all about shaping rental regulations that are the result of successful housing advocacy in US cities. And I just want to point out, this is not only a US phenomenon, right? We've also seen movements around housing inequality, very, very big successful movements in Spain, in Germany, focusing on different kinds of issues, landlord expropriation in Berlin, focusing on private equity developers in Spain. So this is kind of a global moment, but we don't know a lot about these kinds of organizational structures and these coalitions. So what are these movements? Well, on the one hand, we have seen a really grassroots mobilization by tenants in their communities. And we've seen kind of the traditional repertoires of social movement protest. We've seen activism on social media. We've seen street protests. We've seen disruptions in city halls, on commons or other kinds of debates. But we've also seen, I think, an emerging organizational infrastructure around housing activism, right? Not just the grassroots, but an emerging ecology of not only housing activist organizations, but also civil rights and anti-poverty organizations that are here in the field. And here I've just taken the most non-profity picture I could find, two activists in Minneapolis there with their inspiring poster and their whiteboard behind them where they're probably doing some power analyses. These kinds of actors are really important in the field, but we don't know what the structure of these coalitions looks like. So that's what I'm trying to do in the paper. Just to, again, reiterate the previous literature, literature on housing movements has studied how activists generate tenant identities, how they organize around the subjectivity of tenants to create new kinds of political subjectivities in cities. And we know that organizing works a little bit differently from just the traditional service and advocacy functions that most nonprofits do. They really are trying to build solidarity and sustain movement building. And there's been a lot of ethnographic research on these kinds of dimensions. But again, the formalized nonprofits that are active in these housing coalitions are not quite well documented, and we don't actually really understand the factors that cause these coalitions to emerge in cities, although there's a number of suggestions that have not yet been tested. So these are my real kind of intellectual questions in this project, where I'm trying to understand what are the organizational structures of housing movement coalitions, where are they strong, what's their distribution, and what causes these formal housing movement coalitions to emerge. So my approach for addressing this is to use interlocking directorate networks among civic organizations. There's a long history of research on interlocking directorates in corporations, where interlocking directorates are usually used to understand cohesion and alliances among firms. And we know that they they do certain things to the firms that are in them. So, right, an interlock is created when the leader of one organization or an officer of one organization is associated with another organization. And we know that when these leadership connections get created, we tend to see shared ideas diffusing across organizations. We tend to see the leaders of those organizations coming to view themselves as a collective group. And I think that we can not only use this for studies of firms, but also for studies of coalitions, urban civil society, trying to understand how organizational coalitions emerge. So I've done this in the United States, where I follow all relationships among all nonprofit leaders in the 148 largest US cities over the last 20 years, which is spanning about 11.8 million individual civic leaders across all of the records. I've developed some approaches for understanding these longitudinally, which I published in Social Networks, interested in some of the methodological details. And here I've just shown some example networks that are emerging in some cities in Texas to show you kind of the spaghetti graph distribution of what you're really looking at here. So this data comes from nonprofit filings, and it comes from a variety of sources. On the one hand, some historical databases that are on Form 990s, which nonprofits file every year for their tax-exempt status, which gives us their leadership records and names of their boards of directors and executive staff, as well as some more recent data that's been digitized by the IRS, which is responsible, the Internal Revenue Service is responsible for collecting the tax-exempt status of these organizations. I've taken together these two sources of data and then follow these networks that I assemble from these leadership records at the city level over the last 20 years. So how do we define coalitions from this data? Well, there's a variety of different kind of network analytic measures that you could use to understand how housing organizations form relationships with other kinds of organizations. And what I essentially do is use community detection algorithms to look at the structure of relationships and the clustering that exists in urban civil society. I use Louvain, which is essentially an algorithm which tries to get us to understand which organizations tend to be connected with other organizations through their leadership networks and how those groups cluster together. It's a very greedy algorithm. It's very commonly used in firm studies. And it essentially gives you a distribution of the different kinds of communities that emerge from leadership connections across cities over time. From that distribution of communities in cities, you can then look at the interlocks and how they are distributed across those communities. And what I specifically focus on are the joint presence of housing leaders with two other kinds of organizational actors, which are civil rights and anti-poverty organizations. So I'm not looking at the whole distribution of all coalitions. I'm just looking at how housing organizations tend to exist in the same kinds of leadership communities with these two other types. And the justification of that is essentially that these are the most common kinds of coalition partners with housing activism, civil rights, obviously, because there's a close overlap between civil rights advocacy and tenant advocacy. There's also kind of a long history of civil rights organizations providing the kind of dedicated legal aid and other kinds of specific assistance that housing organizations often need. And then there's also a kind of a conflictual, but sometimes collaborative relationship between the traditional anti-poverty sector and housing advocacy. So I think that these are very important coalitions to follow. What I then do is actually use Gini coefficients to understand the distribution of these shared relationships across communities. And the Gini coefficient obviously is typically used to understand wealth distributions or income distributions. We can actually use Gini coefficients broadly to just look at clustering across any kind of categorical distinction. So I get from these different networks a coefficient from 0 to 100 that essentially indexes the extent to which housing, civil rights, and anti-poverty groups are all in the same communities in urban civil societies, whether their leaders all tend to be connected or whether they tend to be distributed across different communities. So a score of 100 here would mean they're all in the same community, and 0 would mean they're all in different ones. And then I just use some very basic regression models to understand changes in coalition cohesion over time. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I won't go into all the independent variables today, just for the sake of time. So, all right, what do I find? 5 minutes. basically, the first and most important finding is that housing movement coalitions are actually quite widespread across the US if you just look at these leadership networks. We typically think of these organizations, of these housing movements being in very large cities and very liberal cities. But if we use just a leadership perspective, or if we focus on these organizational collaborations, we see here in this figure that the distribution of these kinds of alliances is actually quite common. I've colored and sized the circles here on the cities to highlight the relative size of these coalitions, the relative cohesion of these coalitions across places. And what you can actually see is that there are quite a few cities, most who have some moderately cohesive communities of housing, civil rights, anti-poverty leaders across the United States. These networks do tend to be most cohesive in liberal metropolises, such as places like New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco that we expect to have housing activism. But we also see it in some somewhat unexpected cities as well. So for example, if you see, this is the table 1 from the paper, you see that the second most cohesive housing coalition in the United States on this organizational level is actually in Denver, which is a city that we usually don't associate with housing activism. There are also very cohesive networks in San Antonio, Orlando, Louisville, and Miami, which are very large, important cities in the United States, where we've not ethnographically documented a legacy of housing activism, but where we actually do see something emerging, at least on the formal level. Meanwhile, there's a number of cities, of course, that don't have these kinds of coalitions, of course, particularly cities in smaller or more conservative areas. And this is also the case across the US. If we look at change, meanwhile, we see that the greatest increases in cohesion among this nonprofit sector have tended to occur in liberal areas, particularly in the Bay Area of California, like places like San Jose and San Francisco. But we also see a lot of decline as well. So there's been a growth in certain places, but also atrophy of these different kinds of civic coalition networks. If you look at places like Salt Lake City, for example, you've seen really dramatic, actually, declines in the cohesion of these different kinds of nonprofit actors over the last 20 years. Places like Houston also is the 4th largest city in the United States, but apparently does not have a very robust housing coalition. There's actually been declines in the cohesion of these different kinds of actors there as well. So there is some heterogeneity here, a wide distribution of different kinds of housing coalitions, but also an uneven distribution of places where it's growing and where it's declining. Finally, I did a number of different kinds of analyses of the different factors which are associated with the growth of this cohesion within cities, looking at factors like economic insecurity, resource environment, ecological sources of growth, and state policy context. And what I do when I kind of link these census level measures and state level measures to these cohesion indexes, when I do this kind of linking and do the very simple regressional analysis, we find that increases in concentrated disadvantage, increases in municipal spending, and also relatively protectionist tenant landlord law are actually all associated with the growth of these coalitions. So there are kind of a series of factors here which are associated with the coalition environment. They're not just going to emerge in any kind of city, even where there might be demand for housing services or inequality or urban poverty. So what are the major takeaways here? Well, we tend to think of housing movements as being relatively grassroots or limited in the United States, but I think that these results actually show there's a formal component to housing coalitions in the United States, where housing activism is not only militant and visible in US cities, but is also increasingly formal and integrated into urban coalition politics. Housing coalitions also do appear to be emerging in response to rising disadvantage, but also they tend to emerge in favorable policy contexts where municipal spending is higher and where housing policy favors renters already. For research, I think there's a number of contributions here. One is that we usually think of developers and homeowners or NIMBYs as being the kind of hegemonic actors in urban coalition politics. And I think that this shows that cities are a little bit more multipolar now, where renters movements are actually increasingly important. I think that scholarship should actually better understand these coalitions and understand the relationship to both policy and urban inequality. Meanwhile, returning to some of the themes of the talks today, I want to point out that this isn't just astroturfing, right? And formalization and the growth of these organizations has not led to co-optation or demobilization. These movements have actually been quite successful in creating changes in housing policy, but it does suggest that grassroots relationships to coalitions are very complex and creating new tensions in housing movements. So there, I think I'm at time and I'll stop there. Thank you.